Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the day. I realize I'm your barrier to some exciting esports, so I'll try and keep this nice and snappy for you. Right, now, today I'm going to talk to you about service level objectives, and in particular, the key word and the key takeaway from this presentation is effective. How do you make your service level objectives effective? So in this talk, what I'll be talking about is what is it that makes a service level objective effective. I'll take you through the 7-step strategy that we're currently taking teams through at Xero to get to the point where they have effective SLOs. And I'll be sharing some of the lessons that we learned along the way. So firstly, just a little bit of a primer on just what Xero is. Who here has heard of Xero, first of all? Who here uses Xero? A couple of people. My wife uses Xero. And I don't know, a few people that are involved in contracting and so on may use it for managing their accounts and so on. Xero is a platform for accountants and bookkeepers, small business owners, to manage the products and services and get those important business insights that they need to run their business effectively. Over the years, since I started at Xero, I think we were just short of 1 million organizations. And now, as of the end of the last financial year, we're sitting at 1.8 million, and that's been a consistent growth trend since I started, at least. But you can see more than just the number of organizations we serve. We have a number of different types of customers of our platform. 700 connected apps all connect to the ecosystem that we provide at Xero. We also interface with multiple banks. And so you can see the diversity of the product range that we have. And so the question is, how do we maintain the quality of service that our customers expect? And how do we ensure that we adhere to those quality of service standards? And so that's where SLOs come in. So let's drill into those words for a second. What do we mean by a service level? What we're talking about is service quality. So as any good product manager or product owner should know, that journey into product development begins by sensing and measuring how your product performs. Traditionally, they're looking at measures such as engagement with the product, usage of the product, but service quality is just as important to measure and react to. So a service level indicator is a way that you can measure your product, and it describes the way that it has behaved. What level of quality are you providing to your customers? Whereas an objective is an expectation that you place around that indicator. Normally, if you read some of the literature that's out there, that's produced by a few different organizations, they'll combine these definitions with the one for a service level agreement. And in many cases, people might make that leap that by simply defining a service level agreement, they then have an effective SLO. But actually, there's quite a lot and probably a great deal of work that needs to be done once you've defined a service level objective before you could even consider putting an agreement around it. And so while we've trained our teams on adopting service level objectives, we've told them just to avoid thinking about service-level agreements for the time being, because what we really want them to do is adhere to their own objectives and adjust their product planning strategy in accordance with that. So what is it that makes an SLO effective? Well, I believe there's three basic facets to it. The first thing is that an SLO can't be effective unless the product teams that manage a particular service actually have the capability and the capacity to respond to breaches of their objective. And so there are a number of different ways that we can ensure that we make our service level objectives effective. On the other hand, in order for those product teams to actually trust that they're adhering to their service level standards, they need to be sure that those service level indicators are actually meaningful and that the targets that they set around them are also meaningful. Now, once we have manageable and meaningful objectives and indicators, we can then see we can start to move to those indicators and objectives being influential in your product planning. Now, I'm going to revisit this slide at the end, and we'll see how that 7-step strategy that I talk about addresses each of these concerns. Now, I say 7 steps with an asterisk because, like any agile process, this is about continuous improvement. And so the 6th and 7th steps are a process of continuous improvement, and we regularly will review those steps during the life cycle of the product. So it's not a journey that begins and ends. It's one that starts at step 1 and then continues with steps 6 and 7 over that life cycle of the product. The vehicle, or the vehicles that we have to get us, to guide us on this journey, are sort of threefold. First of all, we are educating and informing all of the product teams at Xero about the details behind each of these steps, and that's not a task that we undertook lightly. As you can imagine, training 50-plus product teams around the organization is quite an investment in time and effort. But because this is a fundamental change in the culture of our organization, it's a fundamental change in the way that we manage our products, we felt that this was important enough for us to get face-to-face with our product teams. We also provide self-service content for them to refer back to after they've undertaken our training. Hand in hand with that, we have some tooling that, as you might have guessed, makes use of New Relic to help teams track and review their SLOs. And finally, something that some organizations may overlook as a driver in implementing changes like this is having a policy in place that guides teams to effective SLOs. Now, the key thing about this policy is that it doesn't prescribe the targets that teams need to hold themselves to. Rather, it prescribes the way in which we expect them to adhere to those targets, while leaving the setting of those targets up to them. And that's really important in terms of getting those meaningful and manageable SLOs that I was talking about in the previous slide. So let's start on the 7-step journey. Step 1 is to identify what it is we're talking about when we say a product or a service. And this is quite important because it defines the realm of control for an individual product team. If we draw that boundary too widely, then there are going to be loads of things in there that the product team has no control over and so can't manage. This slide is something I borrowed from New Relic's own blog article on the subject, and this is the same approach that we're taking in general for most of our products. So the key here is to identify all of the components that make up a particular product, and in particular identify the key interactions between that product and its customers. And this will guide you in being able to instrument that product effectively. Essentially, your instrumentation will go where that service boundary actually is. As I said, this does work in the general case, but there are a few types of product architecture where this can be a little bit more challenging. The first kind, and a pattern that we're seeing more and more often, is the asynchronous system. Event-based systems and queue-based systems are a little bit harder to take this approach with, because we don't have that instant feedback, that layered approach to defining a service boundary doesn't work so well in this type of architecture. And so typically there'll be some form of custom instrumentation that you'll need to implement that gives you that end-to-end view of how events travel through that system. It's not impossible to do, it's just a little bit harder. By the same token, some of our teams run platforms for the rest of Xero to run on. Teams that run our network infrastructure, or our database infrastructure, or our compute infrastructure. And they have services that don't really fall into the same category as our typical web-based or API-based service. But again, it isn't impossible to define service-level objectives for these teams and for these products. It's just a little bit harder. And so our typical approach here is to encourage these teams to focus on the services that they have initially that do fit that synchronous web service model, because then they can see the end-to-end process from 1 to 7 and start to understand how SLOs can influence their product planning. More recently, though, as we start to come to the end of the training program, we've now been able to work with some of those teams individually to flesh out a custom instrumentation strategy. Right, so now that we've identified what it is that makes up our product, what do we want to actually measure? And so we've defined a set of introductory key signals that we're expecting each of our product teams to measure. And the reason we've decided on these key signals, specifically availability and latency, is that if I were to ask a room full of engineers, or even a room full of product managers or product owners, the top 2 things they would say when I ask the question, what would your customers consider a poor experience, are a lack of availability, so not being able to access my service when I need access to it, and a lack of timeliness or poor performance. They would be the top 2 things that will come up. There are other things that will come up as answers to that question, but these are by far the top 2. And so we feel it necessary to implement service-level objectives for these 2 broad concepts, availability and latency, before you try to do anything else. Now, availability is so important that we want to measure it in 2 different ways. And we call those 2 different ways the analytic availability and the synthetic availability. Analytic availability is probably more generally known as the error rate, or what we call the inverse error rate, so 100% minus the error rate for a service, and describes how that service performs if we just analyze the behavior. Synthetic availability, on the other hand, describes how that service performs when we synthesize a workload for it to process. And it's the combination of these two things that really give us a full picture on how that service is performing. We have a preference for using analytic availability in that it allows us to see partial availability of a service. So if you have a particular service that's serving multiple functions, and some of those functions are failing, then your analytic availability figure will adjust for that accordingly. The other reason that it's sometimes more appropriate than synthetic availability is illustrated on this graph. So with an analytic availability measure, what we're seeing is how often was that service available when we needed it. So of all possible calls to that service, how many actually were successful? On the other hand, synthetic availability, because it just tests the service periodically, just tells us what period of time or what proportion of time was that service available. And oftentimes, what we really care about more is was that service available when most of our customers actually needed it? Having said that, there is one set of circumstances where synthetic availability really comes to the fore. And that's when we want to see issues around the path to that service as well. When we measure analytic availability, we instrument at the service itself. And that means that if there's an issue in getting to that service, in connecting to that service, maybe in our security infrastructure or in our content distribution network, then we'll fail to see that issue appear. From the analytics availability indicator's point of view, that service is still running fine. It doesn't care that requests don't reach it. However, from the synthetic availability test's point of view, since we're simulating an external consumer of that service, we will see failures occur. And so it's really that combination of both synthetic and analytic availability that helps us to troubleshoot and identify issues in our environment. All right. So the third step, which I'm not going to go into any great detail here today because I'm sure you've heard a lot about service level indicators already, is now that we've defined what we want to measure and identified where we want to measure it, we actually need to go about instrumenting our application so that we can measure it. And we can use any of the various New Relic agents to help us do that. The key thing that I want to point out here is that regardless of the agents that we decide to use, the information or the data from our instrumentation all flows into a central database that we can query in a sort of consistent fashion. And that means that we can basically build a model that we found to be quite flexible in analyzing the performance and defining targets around the performance and the quality of service of a system. So let's imagine that you have a service of some kind. It might be a web-based service, or it might be a queue processor, but it's going to be performing some kind of work. It might be responding to web requests. It might be processing things off a queue. Your instrumentation is going to tell you for each unit of work that it performed, how did it perform that work? How fast was it? Did it perform it successfully? And so then you've come to the first part of our two-step process in defining a service level objective. The first step is to define some criteria around what we expect for that particular objective. So for a latency objective, we're going to be evaluating whether or not each unit of work that we performed was performed fast enough. And that gives us either a true or false outcome for each individual piece of instrumentation that we have. In the case of availability, we'll be looking at the results of a synthetic test, or looking at whether there was an erroneous response recorded for that particular unit of work. We can then aggregate the performance over a particular time period, and the time periods that we're interested in are generally just the last few minutes that the service had been running, and over the last 30 days. And I'll revisit that in a second. So the performance figure is going to be a percentage, a proportion of the work that we had instrumented that met the criteria. And finally, we get to the second step of the second part of each service level objective, which is to define a target. So in this particular case, we need to say whether 66% was an acceptable level of performance for our particular objective. And the trick here is to validate that target against historic performance that you observe for this particular product. I'll get to that in a second as well. To make it easy for our teams to actually develop these SLOs, we created some templates that they can use to set them up and have them tracked. The tool that we use periodically basically turns the criteria and the target that they define into a NURCL query that then gets collected at regular intervals. In most cases, the only decision that they'll have to make is what to set the target at. And the preview functionality that we use helps them to define a suitable target. So this graph here is what we call the SLO Detail View. The blue line indicates your real-time performance for this particular SLO. So how is it performing over the last 30 days? Whereas the black line is what we call the 30-day rolling window of performance. And the name of the game is this. That black line can't drop below your target of 99.7%. If it does, then you need to pivot your product management strategy to address the underlying problems that are occurring with your product. At the same time, if performance, the blue line, the real-time performance drops below the target, then we need teams to react to that. They need to invoke their incident management strategy and their ability to respond to alerts to restore service as quickly as possible. And so setting that target at the right point is really important to having realistic, valid, and meaningful SLOs that we can actually use in practice. So the first main effect of setting an SLO up is that your team is going to start feeling the pain that your customers feel. Because you have set your targets at a point that has been validated against historic performance, whenever you don't adhere to those targets, you'll be alerted to that. And this is where we expect teams to invoke their incident response strategy, to start using the runbooks that they've defined to go and restore that service. Over time, we will learn about recurrent problems with the service, and that will allow us to basically build up a knowledge base of things that would need to be fixed. When our 30-day SLO performance doesn't drop below the yellow line, we may elect to hold off implementing some of those problems or the solutions to those problems that we've identified after encountering some incidents. However, when our monthly performance drops below the target, as it has on the bottom graph, that's when we're requiring teams to pivot and really put some focus on those backlog items that have maybe been neglected for a little while. So in order to do this effectively, once your SLO has been set up, you need to continuously learn and improve so that you can adhere to it. So you'll be continuously learning about patterns in your SLO performance, and you'll be planning remedial actions whenever it drops below the target. In addition, you'll be mitigating the risk of future failures to that product by looking more closely at how you handle releases while that service is below its target for the month. And then finally, once you're in a steady state with SLOs that are meaningful and effective, you'll be looking to wrap SLOs around other parts, other critical areas of your product, so that you can get a sharper focus on those things. So to wrap things up, let's revisit the things that make an SLO effective. So the first thing, organizationally scalable, is a term that I use as a kind of a prerequisite to be able to actually embark on this journey. If you don't have autonomous teams, if you don't have a DevOps culture in your organization, you're going to find it very difficult to implement this strategy, because the people or the teams that feel the pain that your SLOs may inflict on them may be disconnected from the people that actually can do anything about it. And so it's really important that your organization is set up so that you can actually manage your SLOs effectively. Provided you have that in place, though, the fact that we're using service boundaries to identify where to put our SLOs is going to make sure that they're product-centric, and the fact that we're validating our SLO targets against historic performance and what our customers think of our service means that they're realistic, valid, and hopefully uncontroversial, because your product team has agreed to adhere to that target. Good instrumentation means that the performance metrics that we're getting are actually accurate. And with the combination of those things and the policy that we have in place, we can ensure that breaches to our SLO, so dropping below the target, actually provokes a reaction, both in the short term, so restoring service when you need to, and in the medium to longer term, where you maybe haven't adhered to your target over a month, and so you actually pivot your product planning strategy to address that. And by that point, your SLOs are actually driving change in your product strategy, and they're constantly being used to guide the decision-making process in your particular business. So all in all, the 7-step journey is what ticks off all the items in that list. But once you're there, obviously, there's plenty of other places you can go after that. And so defining more SLOs, maybe extending those introductory key signals that we talked about to looking at other things, maybe business-level metrics and other types of signals is where you might want to go after this. But we think that after implementing all of these steps, getting teams to the same level and the same baseline is a really good place to start. Thanks very much. That's the end of my talk, and enjoy the rest of your day.